We will start by opening up to where we were going to talk about tonight, and away we go. So first, I started as I always by saying the limud should be liuli nishmat avi Dov ber Meir ben Reuven Halevi miroti Rachel bat Harav Michael. And tonight, of course, we are talking about Parshat Chukkat, and I think this one of the uh, salient issues in Parshat Chukkat is the story of Moshe and what is called in the Torah is Mei Merivah, the waters of strife. And if we look at the parsha, this whole story takes all of a dozen psukim, 13 psukim actually, one of which is Vaydaber Shel Moshe Lema. So but the story begins is very interesting because there's a seeming introduction to this story. As I said, it's a story we're all familiar with. Children of Israel complain there's no water. Hashem tells Moshe to do something to get them water. Moshe does something, they get water, and then we find that somewhere along the line, something that has happened that causes Moshe to be punished by not being allowed to enter Eretz Yisrael. So the question all the Mefarshim try to struggle with is, let's understand this story and what's going on here. So I'm going to start first by reading I will call the introduction to the story. Parsha, we're in chapter 20 of Midbar, and it says, "Vayavo b'nei Yisrael kol ha'edol mibartzin b'chodesh rishon v'yeshiva mikodesh v'tamah sham Miriam tikaver sham." Now it's interesting, in this first pasuk alone, we have three different references to seemingly the same group of people. It says, "Vayavo b'nei Yisrael." B'nei Yisrael arrived, or they came to. And then it says Kol Ha'edah, the entire congregation. Well, we just said who we were talking about. Why do I need another phrase to describe them? It says they came to Midbar Tzin in the first month. And then it says Vayeshev Ha'am, the nation settled in Kadesh, and Miriam dies there and is buried there. Now the question is, why do we have three different terms here? Bnei Yisrael, Edah, and Ha'am. And I'm not going to answer that right away. I'm just saying that's one of the questions that comes up as we study this section. And then it says in Pasuk Bet, it calls them La'edah. It says, Lo Yamayim La'edah. There was no water for the congregation. And they gathered upon Moshe and Aaron. And then in the next Pasuk, it says, Vayorev Ha'am im Moshe. Not the Edah, not Bnei Yisrael, but now it's the Am. Again, different name to refer to this group. Now it's Vayorev. There is a struggle. There's a rivah, meaning a difference of opinion between the people and Moshe, and they say, wouldn't it have been nice if we had died when all our brothers died before Hashem? Why have you brought this congregation of Hashem to this desert to kill us and our cattle? So again, here we go again. Edah, Kahal. We have all these different references to the people. Why does the Torah seem to be going back and forth between different references? And then they continue. Now the first pasuk says, okay, why'd you bring us out to this desert to die? Okay. The next one now says, again, it gets even worse. Why'd you take us out of Mitzrayim? Taking us to this evil place. It's not a place of planting. Ta'ena v'gef and rinam. There's no no figs, vineyards, pomegranates. There's no water to drink. So Moshe and Aaron's immediate response, they go in front of the kahal, el petach to the tent, to the entrance to the tent to the tent. They flew up and they fall on their faces, presumably in tefillah. And Hashem's presence suddenly manifests itself. So all of this is the introduction to the story. And then we get into the story itself, what actually happened. Okay, you'll have to start with the right side. Now, the right side is what Hashem tells Moshe to do. The left side here is what actually happened. So in Zion and Chet, we have Hashem's command to Moshe. In Tet, Yud, and Yud Aleph, we have what actually happened. So Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe Lemer. Hashem speaks to Moshe and says the following: Kach et hamateh, take the staff, v'hakelet ha'edah, and gather the congregation, the edah. Atav Aaron achicha, you and Aaron your brother. V'dibartem el hasela li'einehem v'natan meimav. And you should speak to the sela, whether sela is a rock, a stone, something like that. Li'einehem, in front of them, v'natan meimav, and it will give forth from its water. Yotzeita lahem mayim min hasela. You should bring forth for them water from this sela. V'yishkito et ha'edah v'et v'iram, and you should allow the edah and their cattle to drink. Okay, so that's the end of the two psukim where Hashem tells Moshe what he's supposed to do. Now we go to what happened. Moshe takes the mateh, the staff from before Hashem. Now notice this gray is something that's not in there at all. So where that comes from, we're going to have to see. Not in the command. It doesn't say that the mateh was milifnei Hashem. Kasher tzivahu, as he was commanded. Moshe and Aaron congregate, gather the kahal to the face of the Selah. And they say to them, Shimu Nahamorim, listen, you rebels. Hamin Haselah Hazeh, is it possible? Will from this rock, Notila Chamayim, will we bring forth for you water? Moshe raises his hand, he hits the rock twice with his staff, with Matehu, his staff twice. And much water comes forth, and everybody gets to drink, and the cattle drink also. So, and then we have the aftermath, where Hashem says to Moshe and Aaron, he says the following: since you have not had faith in me, to sanctify me, Israel, before the eyes of Bnei Israel, you will not be able to bring this kahal to the land that I'm bringing them, I'm giving them. Hema, this entire episode, the Torah now gives the name, is Mei Merivah, the waters of Merivah. Sheravu b'nei Yisrael and Hashem, where b'nei Yisrael strove with Hashem by Kodesh Bam, and they were sanctified through them. So the questions that arise, let's go. I'm going to first raise a whole bunch of questions, and I'm going to try to see how the Parshanim deal with them, and then perhaps see if we can come to some conclusion in the end here. Okay, so again, the first question, why the different names? Bnei Yisrael, Eda, Kahal, why are there all these different names going on? And more importantly, are they referring to the same group of people or not? What happened? Why? The second question that seems very much out of place is the words kasher tzivahu. Moshe takes the mateh as he is commanded, and then says vayakil. Then he and Aaron gather the kahal el pnei hasala. Hold on a minute. Okay. So what seems to be wrong in verse 9 is, if I look at the command to Moshe, Moshe says commanded two things: take the staff, gather the edah, you and Aaron, and then speak to the rock. Okay, those are the three things he's supposed to do. It says he takes the staff, he gathers the congregation, and then it says he lifts up his staff and hits the rock. Okay, but the question is, if he hits he gets the staff and he gathers the congregation, why is this as he is commanded between these two? Shouldn't it have been after the second one? So that's a question we're going to hopefully address a little bit, that this kasher tzivahu, as he was commanded, seems to be in the wrong place, because it seems that gathering everybody together was also like Hashem commanded him. So the kasher tzivahu should be afterwards, not before this gathering the congregation. The next question is, what causes Moshe to say Shimu na hamorim, listen, you rebels? Why is he calling them rebels this time? That's not something we've ever heard from Moshe before. And then, of course, the ultimate question is, was Moshe supposed to hit the rock, or was he supposed to speak to the rock only? And ultimately, notice Hashem does, the end result is that water comes out and everybody gets to drink. Question is, why is Hashem upset, and what is Hashem upset about? So that's some of the questions we have to address and answer. Now, we're all very, very familiar with Rashi's shot. Rashi simply says, let's bring Rashi here. Okay, Rashi firstly says that Kol Ha'edah, the entire congregation, refers to the fact that Shvar Meitu Meitei Midbar Ve'elu Parshul Chayim. The reason it repeats the phrase Edah after saying Bnei Yisrael is to tell us that here we're talking about only those, this is already 40 years later, the entire generation that left Egypt has passed away, has died, and now we're talking about the generation that is going to enter Eretz Yisrael. So we've now shifted from, and this is perhaps now the beginning of the story of generation 2, not the generation that left Egypt, which has been the story of Bamidbar up until this point. Korach's rebellion, the spies, all of the trials and tribulations up until that point were all the generation that left Egypt. Here we're starting basically a new chapter, a new generation, new storyline. And that is why perhaps, at least Rashi is saying that that's why it says Bnei Yisrael and Edah, both of them. That's why it mentions both of these terminologies. Now, Rashi does not seem to address why it says Am and Kahal later on, but that's at least Rashi saying why it mentions Edah after having mentioned Bnei Yisrael. Okay? But Rashi's answer is fairly well known to us. That Rashi is of the opinion that here he says very simply, why did they punish? They punished the Hakdisheni. You did not sanctify me. Because She'ilu dibartem el hasela, had you spoken to the rock, votzi hayiti mikudash le'nei b'nei hoidah. And by speaking to the rock and it bringing forth water, I would have been greatly sanctified among Bnei Yisrael, the Omen, because they would have said, everybody would have said, this rock, which is an inanimate object, doesn't require any sustenance. It's here, it exists. It doesn't need to anything from God. It's there already. But nonetheless, when God says, bring forth water, it brings forth water. How much more so do we who rely on Hashem for our daily sustenance? How much more so should we be fulfilling the commandments of God? That, according to Rashi, is the problem here. The problem is not that what Moshe did was so terribly wrong, but it was a greatly missed opportunity for Moshe Rabbeinu, a person of Moshe Rabbeinu's stature. That's a big problem, okay? Because by not grasping this opportunity to create a great Kiddush Hashem, they missed an opportunity. Okay. Rashbam says very interestingly, he doesn't talk a lot about this, but okay. So Rashbam simply tries to talk about the fact that this mateh milifnei ha'edut, that this mateh, the staff, is a staff that's in front of the congregation, in front of the kahal. And later on, I'm going to bring down in a minute. Let's go right to the Chizkuni. Hold on a minute. Chizkuni is all the way down here. He's out of order. Apologize. Here, I got to float down. Good evening, Andy. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I couldn't. I went on my phone. I couldn't make it. Now I'm back on the computer.
Okay, you can hear me. Okay, fine. Okay.
Sorry, I came late.
No, that's fine. Okay. Chizkuni says very simply, when Hashem tells Moshe to take the mateh, the staff, we all assume that it's the same staff that he's been using all along for the 10 plagues, etc., and the same staff that he took last time when he had to hit the rock 40 years ago. Chizkuni says, no. Zeh hamateh shel Aharon. This is the staff of Aharon that we read about in Parshat Korach that blossomed forth. Why? How do we know that? He took the mateh which was before Hashem. The only mateh that is described as being before Hashem is Aaron's staff that had blossomed with almonds that we read about at the end of last week's parsha. Specifically, there's a reason why he's to take this mateh and not his regular mateh, which he seems he also took his regular mateh because that was his walking stick that he always took. But here he's supposed to specifically take this mateh. This staff is to be a sign for all those who wish to rebel, Mei Merivah, to those who want to question the authority of the Kohanim or the authority of Moshe. That is the whole purpose of this staff. Okay? And that is why Moshe says, Shimuna Hamorim. He calls them rebels. You're rebelling. The fact that God told me to take the staff to remind you that you are supposed to understand that there is a role, there's a way to ask. Yes, you need water. You come respectfully and you ask for water, not this coming as a bunch of rabble rousers. And that's very, very important. And this, however, when he says this causes Moshe to make a mistake, that the fact that he says Kachet Hamates Savar Moshe Lahakot Besela. Okay? But Hashem told him, Oh lo Amar lo Kachet Hamateh El Lefisha Lo Haya Shel Haya Leot Livnei Meri, that this staff is supposed to be the symbol to remind the people not to rebel against Hashem. Okay, so having said that, we are now left with the question of, Rashi says, as we well know, that the mistake is hitting instead of speaking to. There are other parshanim, and I'm not gonna have time to get to, but who also tell us that in reality, the command that Hashem gives Moshe, which is v'dibartem el hasela li'einehem, can be translated in a number of different ways. Even though literally it seems to say that Moshe is supposed to speak to the rock, there are Parshanim who want to tell us that no, it means to speak to Bnei Yisrael al hasela, near the sela, just like we have many times the word el means al. That these two words are interchangeable, that when we say to, it means next to, especially when we're talking about inanimate objects. The Parshanim bring numerous sources and that, which seems to imply that perhaps, at least among some of the Farshim say that Moshe was commanded to speak to Bnei Yisrael in front of the rock to remind them that Hashem is the one bringing forth the water, just like he does in other places. By the mun, he specifically says, behold, Hashem is giving forth the mun. Behold, Hashem is the one providing the water. Hashem is the one fighting for us. So Moshe always, when he's about to perform a miracle, specifically says that the miracle is being performed not by me, not by my stick. It's not that I'm a magician. Hashem has commanded me to perform this miracle in front of you. And that is what he is supposed to be doing here. And that is where the problem arises. The problem arises when Moshe speaks them, he calls them morim, he calls them rebels. And that's, again, if the whole purpose of taking the staff of Aaron is to remind them that they're not supposed to be rebelling, not against Moshe, but they're by rebelling against Moshe, they're rebelling against Hashem, then it makes sense that he's calling them rebels. That makes very good sense. The problem comes in the next sentence, at least according to Rabbeinu Hananel, who is quoted by Ramban and others. He says, Hamin hasela hazeh notzi lachem mayim. Is it possible that from this rock we can bring forth water? And the point is here, what happens is before he hits the rock, Moshe is supposed to do what? He's supposed to say, who is performing this miracle? None other than Hashem. This, according to Rabbeinu Hananel, and Ramban brings this also, is what Moshe does wrong. He does not, in this case, he forgets, because he's upset at the people and he's calling them rebellious, he forgets to ascribe the miracle to Hashem. And that fits, according to Ramban, goes to a great length to explain how this fits in exactly with what Hashem says to Moshe. He says, Yan lo hematem bi lakdisheni. You did not have emunah in me to sanctify me. That fits in seamlessly with Rashi also. It says that the thing that was missing, that Moshe did not, by not speaking to the rock, he says that you missed the opportunity to sanctify me. However, in another place, we are told that it says, Al Hashem altem bi, that you transgressed against me. And again, this whole concept here is the purpose of the miracle of the bringing forth water is to show the people that Hashem can provide for their needs, and there's no reason to be rebelling and questioning Hashem, that Hashem provides everything they need. That message doesn't get across in the same way because of what Moshe says to the Am. Because he says, Notzi lachem mayim, without mentioning Hashem's name, the people now don't know whether this water was created miraculously by Hashem, or it just happens that Moshe knew where there was a spring underground and brought them some water. That failure to ascribe the miracle to Hashem is what the problem is. Okay. Other Parshanim want to tell us lots of other different things. Ibn Ezra brings down 11 different possible things that Moshe could have done wrong and refutes all of them and says they're all not appropriate. And later on, Abarbanel does the same thing with Ibn Ezra's commentary and says the same thing, that all of these don't seem to make sense. And in reality, I think the most important comment here is the one Ramban makes in his first line. Okay, Ramban in the first opening line, before he goes through and tries to figure out exactly what happened, he says the following: Hachet b'Moshe v'Aaron b'Mei Merivah eino mitparsem b'katuv. That whatever sin Moshe and Aaron did at Mei Merivah, the Torah does not speak about it. It really sort of hides it. And then he goes, and the point I think Ramban is trying to make is, yes, we think we may have an understanding of what Moshe may have done wrong, but some of them don't seem to warrant the gravity of the punishment that he is subjected to. And we know that Hashem always punishes midah keneged midah, that the punishment always fits exactly what the transgression was. As such, Ramban seems to be saying that even though, as I said later on, Ramban says, I think what Rabbeinu Hananel said makes sense, this notzi instead of yotzi, but nonetheless, he seems to be saying that we really don't fully understand it. And it's interesting, Nachshoni, in his commentary on this entire thing, where it goes through all the different parshanim, he says very simply that perhaps when it says by Moshe, v'lo yoda ish et kfurato, that nobody knows where he is buried, it's also meant to allude to the fact that we don't know why he had to die before coming into Eretz Yisrael. On the other hand, if we go back to the beginning of the Perek, the first line in the Perek where it talks about Miriam dying and being buried there, we perhaps get a glimpse into what's going on. And I think this perhaps is why the Torah goes to great lengths to talk about the different phraseologies of Bnei Yisrael, Eidah, Am, Kahal. Moshe Rabbeinu is the leader of the generation that's left Egypt. He knows them, he understands them, he knows what the challenge of leading them is, he knows how to deal with them. Moshe is the leader of the past. We now are a new generation and we need new leadership. Not to say that Moshe could not have adjusted and become a successful leader. I don't want to even think of suggesting that. But the fact is that just as Moshe's flock, Moshe's group that he was leading was not to enter Eretz Yisrael, Moshe does not enter Eretz Yisrael in a position of leadership. And I think that in and of itself, which Moshe himself says later on in Sefer Devarim, he says, Gam bi hidanav Hashem biglalchem lemor, Hashem became angry at me for your sake, I think also alludes to the fact that Moshe understood that the reason he couldn't go into Eretz Yisrael was because the people he led were not able to go into Eretz Yisrael. And as such, the leader has to stay with his people. And since his people had to die in the Midbar, perhaps that's why he has to die in the Midbar. It only will get to Eretz Yisrael at some future point in history. That's just a possibility. And that's why perhaps, as again, this whole story is connected directly on the heels of the death of Miriam. And we're going to find that Miriam, Aharon, and Moshe, who are the three leaders of Am Yisrael through the 40 years of getting out from the time they leave Mitzrayim till they get to Eretz Yisrael, they all have to die before Am Yisrael can get into Eretz Yisrael, because they represent the last generation and they are the leaders of the last generation. And as I said, it's interesting because later on we're going to read when Moshe davens Hashem, what if I go in as an ordinary person? And then in the end he doesn't. He says he understands why he can't. The reality of leadership is understanding that every leader has his time, his destined people that he is to lead. And it is few and far between leaders who are able to transition and successfully lead multiple generations. Now, I'm not going to say they don't exist, but clearly they are few and far between, the ability to transition and understand at a later stage in your life the challenges of a younger generation, of a different generation, the generation that didn't experience the experiences you had as a child or in your formative years. And I think that's one of the lessons, perhaps, of this parsha, that leadership is very much a function of understanding the people you're leading, the people you have to interact with. And as leaders, whether it's we are leading our family, we are leading a business, a community, whatever it is, we all have to be able to realize that that leadership will not last forever. The only leadership that lasts forever is our allegiance to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and his leadership. And human leadership, just like our human destiny, is temporal. And that's, I think, one of the lessons that we also have to understand from this week's parsha. And perhaps we will get an greater understanding of what happened here at Mei Merivah, perhaps at some point in the future, when Mashiach will come and answer all our questions and perhaps resolve exactly what did happen and what Hashem's fate was with the coming of the Mashiach from Yameinu. So thank you all for listening. And